David is.
All right, I think we're ready to begin. Colleagues, alors.
Order, please. We are the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today, December 11th, 2012, this is our meeting number 62.
And today we are returning to a study that we looked at some time ago regarding the case of Sergei Magnitsky, a Russian executive who, as you may recall, was murdered. And returning to give us an update on this matter is William Browder, the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, and as well today attending is Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is a member of the Coordinating Council of the Russian Opposition. Gentlemen, we've discussed your witness, your testimony, and you know that either of you may begin, so I invite you to begin speaking. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the Subcommittee on Human Rights for inviting me here today. I'm here. I'd like to, for those of you who don't know the story, I'd like to briefly repeat the story of Sergei Magnitsky and then tell you what's happened since the last time I testified here in front of the subcommittee. The story starts out more than 15 years ago when I moved to Russia to set up Hermitage Capital Management, which became the largest foreign investment firm in Russia. When I was there, I discovered that the companies that I was investing in the Russian stock market were essentially being robbed from billions of dollars were being stolen from these companies. And I decided to try to fight the corruption by researching how it was done and then exposing it through the international media. As you can imagine, doing such a thing didn't create that many friends. And in 2005, November 2005, I was expelled from the country and declared a threat to national security. In 2007, police officers raided my Moscow office and seized all of our corporate documents, and then used those documents through a complicated scheme to steal $230 million of taxes that we had paid to the Russian government the previous year. It wasn't our money that was stolen, it was Russian government money that was stolen. It was a very complicated and legally unpleasant experience, and so we went out and hired a number of lawyers, including a lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky, who was 36 years old, worked for an American law firm at the time, and in my opinion was one of the smartest and most diligent lawyers in Moscow. He went out to investigate the situation and the crime, and he came back with evidence and clear proof that government officials were involved in this enormous $230 million tax theft. Instead of turning a blind eye, as many others would have done at the time, Sergei Magnitsky decided to testify against the officials who were involved. He testified in July of 2008 and again in October of 2008. And then 1 month later, on November 24th, 2008, two subordinates of one of the police officers he testified against came to his home at 8 in the morning in front of his wife and two children and arrested him and put him in pretrial detention. While he was in pretrial detention, he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. His jailers put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in a cell with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, and he nearly froze to death. They put him in a cell with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. After 6 months of this treatment, his health started to break down. He lost 40 pounds, developed severe stomach pains, and was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was prescribed on the 1st of August 2009. 1 week before the scheduled operation, he was abruptly moved away from the prison that had medical facilities to a prison called Butyrka, which is a maximum security prison and widely considered to be one of the toughest prisons in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, at Butyrka, they had no proper medical facilities to treat his ailment. At Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into constant, agonizing, unbearable pain. He and his lawyers made 20 desperate official requests for medical attention. And in spite of his pleas, every single one of his requests were either ignored or denied. Finally, his body succumbed, and on the night of November 16th, he went into critical condition. On that night, the prison officials decided to move him back to a prison with medical facilities. He was transported to Matroshka Tishina prison on that night, but when he arrived there, instead of being treated in the emergency room, he was put in an isolation cell, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him for 1 hour and 18 minutes. He was subsequently found dead on the floor of that cell on the night of November 16th, 2009, more than 3 years ago. How do we know all this? We know it because in Sergei's 358 days in detention, he wrote 450 complaints detailing every aspect of how he was tortured, what they did to him, who did it, where they did it, and how they did it. And because of these documents, he created an unbelievably detailed record of what happened to him. And in conjunction with that, after his death, we've confronted on a legal basis the Russian law enforcement system, and from that we've been able to glean lots of other documents supporting and proving all of the things that he said happened to him. As a result of the documents that he created and the documents that have come out of the Russian justice system, we have what I would consider to be the most well-documented human rights abuse case that's come out of Russia in the last 25 years. Because of all this information, there have now been 39,000 articles in the Russian press since he died mentioning the name Sergei Magnitsky. Now, everything that I've told you is appalling, and you can't not be appalled by it. But what makes this story truly significant on an international political level is not the actual crime that they committed, but what happened afterwards. And what happened afterwards is a high-level government cover-up that goes right up to the president of Russia. It's kind of like Watergate. It wasn't the break-in that made that crime so significant. It was the cover-up that led to the resignation of the President of America at the time. Just to give you some idea of the cover-up, one day after Sergei died, the Russian Interior Ministry announced that Sergei had never complained about his health and that he died of natural causes with no signs of violence, even though looking at any pictures which come from the autopsy report, you can see his arms and wrists and knees are black and blue. Every single one of the police officers, judges, jailers, and members of the security service involved in this case have been formally exonerated. Some have even been promoted and granted state honors. And if that wasn't enough, to add insult to injury, they're now taking Sergei to court more than 2 years after his death and prosecuting him in the very first posthumous prosecution in Russian history. They're putting a dead man on trial. And if that wasn't enough, the same officials who killed Sergei are now summoning his grieving mother and wife in the case as a witness against their dead son and husband. Given these circumstances, it is clear that no justice is possible inside of Russia, and so I and his family have sought justice outside of Russia. In 2010, I was invited to testify in front of the U.S. Congress to tell the story of Sergei Magnitsky. And following my testimonies, Senator Benjamin Cardin, the co-chair of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, and Representative Jim McGovern, co-chair of the Lantos House Human Rights Subcommittee, proposed an initiative to withdraw the U.S. visas of the 60 officials identified as playing a role in the Sergei Magnitsky case. We couldn't necessarily force the Russian government to prosecute his killers, but we certainly didn't have they certainly didn't have the right to enter the U.S. On November 15, 2012, with an unprecedented bipartisanship, the U.S. House of Representatives voted in favor of passing the Magnitsky Act 365 to 43. The U.S. Senate voted last Thursday, passing the Magnitsky Act 92 to 4. The Magnitsky Act freezes assets, and bans visas and names of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. And it goes broader than that. It bans visas, freezes assets, and names of people who perpetrate other human rights abuses in Russia. Since the Magnitsky Act was proposed, 11 parliaments around the world, including this parliament, have introduced motions, resolutions, petitions, and legislation which have called for visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, as well as others who perpetrate gross human rights abuses in Russia. Resolutions calling for visa bans and asset freezes have also been passed in the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. There is only one group of people in the world who are against this legislation, and that is the Russian regime itself. They're absolutely terrified that this would possibly come into force. Until now, they've lived in a world where they can commit human rights abuses with no consequence, since they control their own justice system and they know that they can torture and kill with full knowledge that nothing will happen to them. In many ways, they cannot control their own system if they cannot guarantee impunity for the foot soldiers who commit these crimes. The Russian hierarchy, after initially dismissing such threats of sanctions, are now so terrified of the repercussions of this legislation that 3 days after President Putin was re-inaugurated, he announced that his third most important foreign policy priority was to fight Magnitsky sanctions. He assigned his foreign minister to publicly threaten any country that considered passing Magnitsky sanctions. In an unprecedented move, members of the Russian parliament were actually sent to Washington to slander Sergei Magnitsky and try to talk Congress out of passing the Magnitsky Act, which they failed at. I'm here today to urge you, the members of the Canadian House of Commons, to follow the lead of the U.S. Congress and join parliamentarians across Europe and to deny visas and place asset freezes on the people who played a part in the false arrest, torture, and denial of medical care and death of Sergei Magnitsky, and on those who took part in the cover-up of this thing. They should not be able to come to Canada freely, and they should not be able to buy properties here, take holidays here, and enjoy the fruits of their blood money here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Browder. Mr. Karamutsa, I invite you to begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mrs. Vice Chairman, honourable members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for holding this timely and important meeting today and for the opportunity to appear before you. The tragic story of Sergei Magnitsky, whose only crime, in quotation marks, was to stand against corruption, is unfortunately symptomatic of the general situation in Vladimir Putin's Russia, where state-sanctioned theft and extortion, politically motivated prosecutions, wrongful imprisonment, police abuse, media censorship, suppression of peaceful assembly, and electoral fraud have become norm. According to the World Bank, corruption now engulfs 48% of the entire Russian economy. During Mr. Putin's rule, his close entourage came to control large sectors of the economy, most notably the energy sector, and the president's personal friends have become dollar-term billionaires. At the very same time, the judicial and legislative branches were turned into rubber stamps. Many of those who refused to toe the line ended up in prison, suffice to mention Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Independent television channels were shut down, opposition rallies repeatedly dispersed by force, elections routinely falsified. No Russian vote has been judged free and fair by either the OSCE or the Council of Europe since the year 2000. L'histoire tragique de Sergei Magnitsky dans le crime.
The tragic history of what happened to Mr. Magnitsky was simply due to his decision to fight against injustices under the Putin regime, where extortion is supported by the state, imprisonment is legal, power abuse by the police, the quashing of pacific demonstrations, electoral fraud, etc., have become the standard.
Just in the last few months, Mr. Putin has signed a barrage of new repressive laws. The fines for, quote, violations during public street rallies were increased to $10,000. That's 10 times Russia's average monthly salary. And of course, it is the authorities who decide what constitutes a violation. Non-governmental organizations that accept funding from abroad are being forced to tag themselves as, quote, foreign agents. And this includes such reputable human rights groups as Memorial, founded by Andrei Sakharov. While the definition of high treason in the penal code, which is punishable by up to 20 years in jail, has been broadened to such an extent that it can include almost any contact with a foreign country or foreign organization or an international organization. Police also this year conducted raids on the homes of leading opposition figures, including former Russian Deputy Prime Minister Boris Nemtsov, who was a guest here at this parliament just a few months ago. Opposition leaders such as Alexei Navalny and Sergei Udaltsov found themselves under criminal investigation. Perhaps most incredibly, a Russian opposition activist, Leonid Razvozhaev, was recently kidnapped on the sovereign territory of Ukraine, forcibly brought back to Russia, and tortured into, quote, confessing his guilt. Needless to say, there are no domestic legal mechanisms for Russian citizens to defend themselves against such abuses. Fortunately, there are international norms. The Moscow document of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, to which both Russia and Canada are party, explicitly states that, and I quote, "Issues relating to human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy and the rule of law are matters of direct and legitimate concern to all participating states and do not belong exclusively to the internal affairs of the state concerned." End of quote. It is no secret that a great number of Russian officials, while preferring the style of governance of Zimbabwe or Belarus at home, are choosing the countries of North America and Western Europe when it comes to their bank deposits, their vacation homes, or schooling for their children. This double standard must end. It is time for some personal accountability for those who continue to violate the rights and plunder the resources of Russian citizens. The Russian opposition and civil society, as well as a strong plurality of Russian citizens, according to most recent opinion polls, back measures such as the Magnitsky Act, which was passed by the United States Congress last week. Measures that introduce targeted visa sanctions and asset freezes on those implicated in the case of Sergei Magnitsky, as well as those implicated in other cases of gross violations of human rights in the Russian Federation. In particular, as the new American law mentions, the rights to freedom of association and assembly, fair trial, and democratic elections. Ce n'est pas un secret que tout en optant pour le style de gouvernement de Zimbabwe,
It is not a secret that while opting for a style of government like you have in Belarus or Zimbabwe, Russian nationals who have benefited from this system prefer to spend their holidays, educate their children, and have secondary residences in North America. This double standard must be abandoned. Those who continue to violate rights and to plunder the resources of Russian citizens must in the end be held responsible and accountable.
339 has been introduced in this House by the Honourable Member for Mount Royal, Mr. Kotler, a member of this subcommittee. In our view, in the view of the Russian opposition, this is a much-needed and long overdue measure that deserves full attention, and it could be strengthened even further by including an asset freeze provision and by covering other human rights violations beyond those in the case of Sergei Magnitsky. Mr. Chairman, 1 year ago this week, 100,000 people gathered on Bolotnaya Square in central Moscow, literally just across the river from the Kremlin walls, to demand free elections, the rule of law, the release of political prisoners, and democratic reforms. This was the start of the largest wave of pro-democracy demonstrations in Russia since the fall of communism in 1991. Russia is changing, and the task of bringing this democratic change to our country is, of course, the task for us, the Russian opposition, and not for any outside players. But if the world's democratic nations, if our friends and allies here in the Canadian Parliament want to show solidarity with the Russian people and want to stand up for the universal values of human rights, human dignity, democracy, I think the best way to do it is to tell those crooks, those murderers, those abusers, that they are not welcome in your country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kara-Murza. Colleagues, we have exactly 36 minutes. We have 6 questioners, and therefore, if we are very precise about it, we'll have time for 6-minute rounds each, but I'll have to be quite strict in enforcing the 6-minute cutoff to achieve that. That being said, we begin with Ms. Grewal.
Thank you, Chair, and my questions go to Mr. Browder. Mr. Browder, thank you very much for appearing before our committee today and to discuss the tragic death of Sergei Magnitsky. Well, I understand that you were prohibited from entering Russia in November 2005 because you were considered to be a threat to the national security. Could you please explain why the Russian government banned you from the country?
When I set up my investment fund in 1996, I was aware that Russia was a chaotic place, but I didn't realize how corrupt Russia was. And I discovered that the companies that I was investing in were having all the money stolen from them. So big companies like Gazprom, which you've probably heard of, were losing billions, in some cases many multiples of billions, from the company through corrupt schemes. And I felt that this was both a morally incorrect thing and a financially incorrect thing for anybody who had an interest in Gazprom. And so we went out and started to do research on how they went about doing the stealing of the money. And we spent anywhere from sort of 3 to 6 months in different cases doing what we call forensic research. And then we took that research and we shared it with the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times, Business Week, Washington Post, etc. And the newspapers all published the stories, and then there were many, many more stories about that. And as a result of that particular incident, the CEO of Gazprom was ultimately dismissed from his job because of this publicity. We went out doing this in a number of other cases, and as a result of that, we ended up infuriating people with very close links to the top of the Russian government, and because of that, they ended up making a decision to expel me, and they used the national security provisions in their law to do that.
Are you currently under investigation in Russia, and if so, what are the charges against you?
So after I was expelled, our offices were raided. After our offices were raided, our companies were stolen. After our companies were stolen, we filed criminal complaints against the police officers involved in stealing the companies. And the same police officers then, in February 2008, opened up a criminal case against me for tax evasion in 2001, purely in retaliation for us complaining about them. And on the basis of that, they've run a criminal case against me. It was the same criminal case that they then used to arrest Sergei Magnitsky, even though he had nothing to do with the companies that supposedly had evaded taxes. And because of that, he ended up dying in prison. The posthumous case against Sergei Magnitsky is also a case in which I'm going to be tried. So he's going to be tried as a dead man. I'm going to be tried in absentia sometime in the next month or two in Russia.
And how profitable was Hermitage Capital Management during its time in Russia?
So Hermitage Capital Management was extremely profitable. We, if you had invested at the beginning of our fund, you would have made, depending on what time you invested, you would have made hundreds, if not thousands of % on your investment in our fund.
I see. Officially, Mr. Magnitsky, he died of a heart failure. Well, what evidence do you have to suggest that this was not the case and that he was in fact murdered?
Well, what we have is the Moscow Public Oversight Commission, which is a independent body of prison overseers, as well as the President's Human Rights Council, which is the Human Rights Council that reports to the President, have both done an independent investigation and both concluded that he was tortured in prison, that his right to life was violated, that he was beaten before his death, that he probably died as a result of his beating, and that he was left untreated for a number of very serious medical ailments where they were deliberately not providing treatment. And so it's not me saying it, it's all sorts of independent bodies who are saying that.
Well, Russian businessman Dmitry Kluyev, who you have implicated in the death of Mr. Magnitsky, says he has absolutely no ties whatsoever with the late lawyer, and that the whole story it's a massive public relations campaign, and on your part to clear your own name. So how do you respond to this accusation?
Well, the role of Dmitry Kluyev in this crime is relatively well documented. He owned the bank that received the stolen money. He was also involved in working with the same lawyer who did all of the fraudulent lawsuits. He was involved in a similar fraud when she was convicted of fraud, working with the same lawyer in previous times. There's a whole body of evidence proving his connection to this thing and his involvement in this thing. And so obviously it's we don't have time to litigate Dmitry Kluev's involvement here, but what I can say is that we believe, with the evidence that we have, that he's deeply implicated in this crime.
Officers from Russia's Interior Ministry are alleged to have engaged in a massive kind of conspiracy against the Hermitage. So could you explain a little bit about this?
So the officers of the Interior Ministry were the ones who raided our office. Mm-hmm. They seized the documents from our office, and then the documents were used in the fraud to re-register our companies out of our name into the name of a man who had been convicted of murder and let out of jail early. The documents were in the possession of the Interior Ministry when they were used for the fraud. The documents were also used to fabricate $1 billion of fake backdated contracts were then used to perpetrate the fraud. And those unique documents which were seized and in the custody of the Interior Ministry were used for both parts of the fraud. And so by any sort of objective measurement, and again, confirmed by other independent bodies, the Interior Ministry was deeply implicated in this whole mess.
Well,
actually, I'm afraid,
there
Ms.
seems to
Graywall,
be just a very short question.
I'm afraid you're actually substantially over your time.
Very short.
It doesn't change the fact that you're over your time. You're going to have to give it to Mr. Sweet, perhaps. We've got to go to our next questioner. Mr. Marsden, that would be you.
Okay. This case, we were just having a little bit of a discussion in back there, because normally when we think in terms of sanctions and refusing entry to folks, that type of thing, it is usually in cases where there's a huge situation within the country. What you're telling us is indicating is there that the human rights violations are across the country, and that normally we have broader evidence before us. Now we've looked at this situation before. We've already agreed in our motion before. But what's striking for me, when Putin returned, did things ratchet up? Did the problems increase at that point in time?
Who is this for?
Either one.
Why don't you take this one?
Well, the biggest fear of Mr. Putin since 2004, when the Ukrainian Orange Revolution happened, was the repeat of a similar scenario in Russia. And that's why he created Nashi, which translates as Ours, which was a pro-Kremlin youth organization designed to kind of control the streets and keep the opposition from the streets and harass the human rights activists and the opposition supporters. But of course, for all the efforts they put into this, they failed, because over the past year we've seen tens of thousands of Russian citizens coming out on the streets in the biggest cities, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, to protest against the corrupt and authoritarian regime of Mr. Putin, and to demand democratic rights and demand their civic dignity, essentially. So exactly the scenario that they feared began to be realized a year ago. In fact, a year ago, yesterday was the largest was the first large demonstration. So, their initial reaction was concessions, to offer concessions. You recall that they reinstated gubernatorial elections, which they had abolished previously. They eased requirements for presidential candidates to register for the ballot, and they eased requirements to register new political parties. That was their initial reaction, because they were really genuinely afraid in December 2011. They did not. It was really sudden for them, because they had got used to essentially apathy and public indifference over the previous decade. But any autocratic regime passes that line between indifference and indignation. And Putin passed that line a year ago, and people came out on the streets. So what they've been trying to do in the past few months, as I kind of touched on in the opening statement, was to increase repression in the hope of driving up fear and driving the opposition movement down with these new laws, with the massive beatings, for instance, of demonstrators during the protest against Putin's inauguration in May, when more than 1,000 people were detained and 50 people were beaten over 2 days.
The Russian Presidential Council for the Development of Civil Society and Human Rights. A question that was here is a suggested question: is that a body of any credibility? Was that more window dressing along the lines of what they were doing by giving a little more access for political parties and for opposition parties?
It is essentially a decoration. It is window dressing, especially during the past few months when about a third of members left after Mr. Putin returned, I quote returned because he never left, after he formally returned to the Kremlin.
Can I say something here? The Presidential Council on Human Rights actually consists of highly decorated, objectively proper human rights activists. However, it has no power whatsoever. And so when they came up with absolutely damning conclusions on the way that Sergei Magnitsky had been treated, and they submitted those to the president. And they said basically his right to life was violated by the state, that he was tortured in custody, that he had the people who had killed him were basically the same people who he had testified against. And they presented this to the president of the country on July 5th, 2011. And the president, Medvedev at the time, said, "I acknowledge that crimes were committed." And to this day, with the exception of one low-level doctor, not a single person has been prosecuted. And that tells you that as much as they have these organizations, and some of them are credible, like this organization, and that's why a number of the members resigned, because they said, what's the purpose of sitting on this council where they can use our name to say that there's some kind of credible...
To validate things, yeah. One of the things that struck me in the testimony is all the comprehensive reporting and things that he did before his death. How did he get that out of prison?
Very good question. There's something unusual about Russia, and a lot of people have that same question. Russia is a country of lawlessness, but it's also a country where within the lawlessness they're absolutely wedded to procedure. And so the procedure is you can file as many complaints as you want, and we can reject your complaints for no reason. And it's a closed system where nobody ever believed that any of the documents would ever see the light of day, where anyone could look at it objectively from the outside. And I think that now they're understanding what a huge mistake they made by allowing this to happen.
Well, it sounds like a contradiction in terms when he's cobbled together all of the evidence, and that they were allowing that to get through.
Well, because they never thought there would be any use to the evidence. Because they've always lived in a world of absolute impunity. Up until today, there's absolute impunity. So they thought, doesn't matter what he says, doesn't matter what the evidence is, because the evidence can't be used. They never anticipated in their worst nightmares that I would be sitting here in front of the Canadian Parliament recounting the story from this evidence. That never, ever entered their mind.
And there's no court system in Russia to consider that evidence, so...
I'm afraid, Mr. Marsden, your time is up.
Thank you.
Before we go any further, though, I just wanted to ask a question. Mr. Magnitsky's numerous complaints and also the report of the Presidential Human Rights Commission, are any of these documents available in a form that could be used by this committee? I was just questioning our analyst as to whether she'd be able to find them, and she had not at present, so I wondered if you'd be able to direct us to
There's a website called www.russian-untouchables.com, which is a campaign website put together by the supporters and friends of Sergei Magnitsky, and it's a library of documents. And on that website, you can get access to the President's Human Rights Council report, the Moscow Public Oversight Commission, and many English translations of Sergei's complaints, and many more Russian original versions that aren't translated. And so, of course, we're happy to work with and support any analytical efforts that you wanted to take here above and beyond what's available on the website.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sweet, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for bringing this case to another level of consciousness for us. We've already previously made a statement regarding Mr. Magnitsky's treatment, but I wanted to ask you, Mr. Browder, what is the state of your security right now? I mean, you're not dealing with a schoolyard bully. You're dealing with some substantial characters in this regard. Have you been receiving death threats? What's the situation for you?
So, unfortunately, since this whole saga began, I and my colleagues who've been working on this campaign have received 10 death threats in London. Some of them have clearly originated from Russia. This is not a safe occupation to be fighting for justice. In this case, we're fighting against some extremely dangerous, murderous people who have shown a capacity to kill and have every capability of killing in the future. We are all living under the threat of being murdered. There was recently an unexplained death of a whistleblower who came forward in the summer of 2011 in London to us, who had previously been involved with the criminal group that did this. He came forward with documents in London proving the involvement of certain tax officials in this case, along with bank statements proving their involvement. He gave us those documents. We passed those documents to the Swiss prosecutor and the Swiss police, who opened up a major money laundering investigation and froze millions of dollars of assets. And about a month ago, this man, Alexander Polichny, at the age of 44, in perfect health, dropped dead outside his house in Surrey. So we don't know what the cause of death was, and the police are investigating. But it does give everybody involved a clear cause for concern.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Outside his house, not
Surrey,
in Russia, but
not
where?
in London.
London. Mr. Carr, I'm with Mr. Browder's testimony, 39,000 articles that have been published, primarily talking about the collusion of Russian officials with what seems to be mafia. And now, although Russian society is not as free as the Western world, it's not like Iran. It's not almost a totally closed society. I'm surprised. How come people aren't marching on the streets in regards to these kinds of things, with the government being virtually in bed with organized crime?
Thank you very much. Well, they are. In fact, one of the principal demands of the mass demonstrations of the past years has been not just free elections, not just political reform, but also rule of law, because people realize that this lawlessness and arbitrariness and violence and corruption, this is happening, this is the daily norm around them, and there's no defense against it inside the country. And in fact, situations such as this are one of the key motivators for those unprecedentedly large rallies that we've been seeing. And the other one is people want to be treated as citizens in their own country with full rights and liberties, and not treated as cattle, voiceless, and that people who can just be told anything and have to shut up and accept it. But in terms of, you raise a very important point about media freedom. The situation in Russia is that all national television channels are under government control, and you will not hear a word about this case on national TV channels. In fact, one of the kind of more liberal TV commentators, Vladimir Posner, who has a reputation of being more liberal, he tried to mention the name of Sergei Magnitsky in his show, and it was the show is recorded. It's not live. You don't have any live political shows on Russian TV anymore. But he mentioned the name, and it was cut out of the program, so you will not hear about that. Russian internet is free, and some of the small circulation newspapers are free of censorship. And so the statistics about the articles and the reporting refers to those. But in terms of just the relationship, again, between the media sector and this case, I used to work for a Russian television channel until this summer of 2012. And I was fired from it and actually blacklisted from all other Russian media pretty openly by Kremlin officials for supporting the Magnitsky legislation and for supporting these kinds of measures against crooks and abusers and human rights violators. So it's a pretty hot topic for the Russian regime. In fact, it's the #1 topic right now after the Americans passed a law. And as Mr. Browder mentioned, one of the first things Putin did after his inauguration in May was to sign this directive to the foreign ministry tasking his diplomats with fighting the Magnitsky legislation being adopted in Western countries, because they're afraid of this, and they understand how serious this could be for their interest and for their ill-gotten money, which they have shoved around in Western banks.
So this testimony here today puts you at increased risk as well.
Well, I mentioned this new high treason law, which this new definition of high treason is consulting with the representatives of foreign country or foreign organization or international organization. We could, any of us who goes abroad and talks to members of parliament or representatives of civil societies even, I guess, could be put under that. They haven't used it yet. It's only been signed about 3 or 4 weeks ago, this new definition of high treason. But we'll see where it goes. But this is a really important point for all of us, and all of Russia's opposition leadership is really committed to this because we think this is that new standard that could really strike at the heart of this criminal mafia system that has ruled our country for the past 12 years, and it's really important for us, and we're not going to give this up.
Mr. Browder, who is...
I'm actually afraid to
Okay.
up your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Professor Kotler, please.
You referred to the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act 212 that has just been passed by Congress, and that will require the Secretary of State to impose visa bans, asset seizures on those implicated in the Magnitsky torture, death, and detention, corporate tax fraud, and the like. My question is it likely to have any effect on bringing, on bringing the perpetrators in Russia to justice? What impact might it have in Russia itself?
The impact of this, there's one thing you missed when you were summarizing the act in America, which is that it applies to all the people who did that to Sergei, plus all other gross human rights abusers. I don't believe in the current regime that the Russian government will ever create a proper justice, a proper investigation and bring to justice the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. However, if you create a consequence for this and other crimes, then people in the future may decide not to commit those crimes because there's a consequence. Right now, if you're an immoral person where you get a full benefit for committing a crime and there's no cost for not committing, or no cost to committing the crime, then you'll commit a crime. If all of a sudden there's a chance that your assets will be frozen and you can't travel, you might think twice about committing a crime. And my hope as a campaigner for justice, but also for Sergei's legacy, is that the law that with his name on it will save lives in the future because people will be afraid to do these types of things.
I'd like to just absolutely concur with what Mr. Browder said. For us, that's the major point of expanding the provisions of the bill to include other gross human rights violations, so that this doesn't just end the impunity for those criminals involved in this case, but also serves as a potential deterrent to those who, when faced with a choice of, carrying out a criminal order, but then thinking about that may mean losing access to their Western bank account, that those people may think twice, and that's a very important point as well.
What steps do you think here in Canada we can take in order to support the fight against corruption and the rule of law in Russia?
Well, this is number 1, 2, and 3. Those targeted personal sanctions. Once again, these are not sanctions against Russia, as the Kremlin propaganda tries to trumpet, and they fail in that. Of course, as we see from the opinion polls, more Russians support this than don't. But this is really it. I mean, it's for the Russian opposition, obviously, and for Russian society to achieve political change in Russia. But this is the greatest possible help to strike directly at the abusers, at the corrupt officials, at the crooks, to close the access to their ill-gotten money that they plundered from the Russian people, from Russian taxpayers, and that they keep here meaning in Western nations, and having invested in Western assets and sending their kids to receive education here, closing those avenues for them. I mean, they may not, for now, be facing any kind of accountability or responsibility or punishment in Russia. They will one day, there's no doubt about it, but they may not be facing that now, but there's no reason why they should enjoy the privilege of having the access to the nations of North America and Western Europe. That's the best way to help the Russian people in their struggle for the rule of law and in a struggle for democracy, is to tell those abusers and thieves that they're not welcome here, and that they're not welcome anywhere in the Western world.
Well, let me just add one point. It's oftentimes, I've been working to try to get justice for the last 3 years, and the first thing that's always offered up when I go visit government officials or parliamentarians in the early stages of this campaign was, we're going to bring this up with the Russians. We're going to bring this case up with the Russians. And what we've learned very quickly is that the old technology of bringing up cases with the Russians has no impact whatsoever. Plenty of people words basically don't do anything. They're not interested in words. They're interested in consequences. And so what are the range of options in terms of creating consequences? There's not that many. We don't have jurisdiction over the crimes that they commit in those countries. But the one thing that we have jurisdiction over in the West that costs us nothing is the ability to let these people into our countries and the ability to let these people use our financial sector. And that is something that we have the ability to do. That's something that they cherish, they covet. And it's something that for no cost to us, we can cut off. And that's the one thing and the only thing that we can do. And we've tried every other option.
Mr. Chairman?
You have 1 more minute.
Yeah, I'd like to use it. I have to leave because I have an SO31 that I must do, but I'm just wondering if in the course of this minute I had a resolution circulate which basically reaffirms the resolution that we once passed and then adds just the following elements to it.
After clerk, circulate that while you're chatting.
Yeah. After reaffirming the resolution that we passed in the whereases, it basically then says, and this is the operative parts, be it resolved that the subcommittee condemns the posthumous trial of Sergei Magnitsky, the first such trial in Russian history, deplores efforts to tamper with evidence and threaten witnesses and the family of Sergei Magnitsky, then it take note of recent legislation passed in the U.S. and the EU in this matter, and therefore reaffirm our call of last time regarding what the government of Canada can do to explore options in this regard. I'm not reading out the whole thing because it's all there set before you, and we passed most of it on our previous meeting.
Professor, we're meeting on Thursday. I wonder if we were to leave this till then, it might give us the members time to review it, and we could then have it discussed at that time. Would that be reasonable from your perspective? Okay, let's do that. All right, so we'll set that aside and take a look at that at our Thursday meeting. Mr. Schellenberger, you offered to take your 6 minutes and divide it with your colleagues. Why don't we have you begin, and then we'll follow with Mr. Sweet.
Let Mr. Sweet start. I think he has a very important question.
Thank you, Mr. Schellenberger. The other thing I just realized, too, when thinking about this question is that I've seen a lot of instances where lawyers have defended people in human rights cases, but I would certainly want to be the lawyer that was lucky enough that my client would actually come to my defense afterwards as well, too, in this case. So I commend Mr. Browder in that regard. It's very unique and is an example of the extraordinary character that you are. Mr. Browder, I wanted to ask you, who are the victims here? Hermitage, who are the clients that lost this money? After this money was pillaged, somebody obviously, we've been talking about Sergei Magnitsky, and rightly so, but somebody obviously suffered a huge loss here, too, in this fraud.
This is the interesting part. We didn't, Hermitage nor our clients suffered in terms of there was no money stolen from us. The money that was stolen was exclusively and only the tax money that we paid to the Russian government, and it was stolen from the Russian people. So this is not, I'm not here fighting for money. I'm here because my lawyer was killed fighting for the money of his own country. This is the Russian people's money. And that's what makes this so unbelievable, is that the Russian government is now they've absolutely refused to prosecute anyone who's stolen the money from their own country, and they're threatening other countries who want to sanction, who want to sanction the officials who stole the money and then killed the lawyer who exposed it. That's what makes this so unbelievably strange. Is that it's not like they stole money from a foreigner and I'm fighting over money. They stole their own money.
Yeah, it is strange and bizarre. Thank you, Mr. Browder.
Well, there seems to be some sort of discrepancy over Mr. Magnitsky's employment. Most media stories refer to him as a lawyer, but he's also described as an accountant. Who worked at Firestone Duncan as an auditor. So, what was his actually official job?
Sergei Magnitsky was a lawyer. He represented me in court. The Russian government, I should say, some Russian officials are going around saying he wasn't a lawyer. Therefore, we should have killed the guy. I mean, he was my lawyer. He was in court. He's other people's lawyers in court. What they're referring to is that he wasn't a barrister. There's in Russia, I mean, you have a barrister and you have solicitors. He was a solicitor, not a barrister.
Thank you. Mr. Schellenberger.
Thank you. I find the testimony here today to be amazing. I'm new on this committee, and that's why I haven't asked too many questions. It's been a real learning curve for me, and to hear the testimony today, it's incredible. So I really have one question. In your view, how can Canada best support and strengthen Russia's civil society and her work of human rights defenders and independent journalists? How can we do that?
Well, the one way you can do it is by getting your government. We have a different system. You have a different system in Canada than America has, which is there was a separation of powers. We could actually get members of Congress to pass a law which the president more or less had to sign. Here, you have a government. You have a parliament, which the majority of which then forms the government. And so this is a nonpartisan issue. This is not a left or a right or a middle issue. And in different countries, I work with people from all different shades of the political spectrum. This is in Washington. They dropped all their arms in bipartisan, and for a brief moment in bipartisanship, they did the right thing here. And what I'm asking for here is for all of you to work together to get your government. And your governments don't like to pick fights with other countries, and the Russians are going to pick a fight over this. But this is important, and I should point out one last thing, which is I was making a speech last night in Toronto to a group of diaspora from Central Europe, from Ukraine, from Russia, from Estonia, etc. And I met with the presidents of all those different diaspora groups, which represent 4 million Canadians, and they are fully, completely committed to this cause in Canada because they care about it. And they will be pushing you and your colleagues to support this and to get the government to support this, because it's more important making sure that those 4 million Canadians feel like the right thing has been done than the Russians feel like the right thing has been done for their interests.
I would say the first thing, the most obvious, shed the spotlight and say the truth. I mean, that's always sounds banal, but it's really, really important. For instance, I remember on March the 5th of this year, that's the day after Mr. Putin's, quote, election victory. There was a big rally on Moscow's Pushkinskaya Square, and we were all standing there. I remember seeing literally a sea of faces and flags of different movements, parties, left, right, doesn't matter, people just coming together to, once again, to stand up for the dignity and to protest this election fraud that's just been accomplished. And at that very time, as we were standing there, the U.S. State Department issued a congratulatory note congratulating the Russian people, no less, for having held a presidential election. And that's not what we were prepared to hear at that moment. I mean, that was taken as, I mean, obviously, we all understand there's such thing as protocol, as a need to cooperate, even with non-democratic countries. That's all clear. But congratulating a people, after an election fraud has been done to them was taken as at best as a mockery and at worst as an insult. So to always tell the truth is very important, and to call things for what they are. Secondly, I would say, and of course shedding spotlight, I mean holding meetings such as the one you're holding today. These are very important, and these are noticed. I promise you, these are noticed a great deal back in Moscow. Secondly, I would say it's very fortunate that we have this OSCE mechanism, which contains these provisions that human rights are global and they're matters of international concern. And when Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov say don't interfere in our internal affairs, they're not telling the truth, and they know it, because issues of human rights are not considered internal affairs. These are matters of international concern. So things like election observation missions, which was, of course, a big deal a year ago when there were many, many observers, both international and domestic, and when the scale of the fraud, when about 30 million votes were stolen by Mr. Putin in favor of his party in the parliamentary election a year ago, that played a huge role in the protest movement and in the awakening of Russian civil society. So these kind of OSCE mechanisms of election observation, of media assistance, you mentioned journalists, that's very important too. And thirdly, of course, and that's actually the first priority, is once again the subject of our meeting today, the Magnitsky legislation against human rights abuses. A clear signal, and not just words but action.
Thank you.
Thank you. Monsieur Jacob, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à nos témoins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. My two questions are for Mr. Karamurza. The first one, the former owner of Yuzhkov Oil, Mr. Godovsky, who is also a political dissident, was imprisoned in Russia for close to a decade. Yuzhkov Oil, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And I would like to have your views on the political and human rights issues in the country. He gave interviews to the press, he published a book, he made statements publicly, etc. You recently joined a think tank funded or created by Mr. Khodorkovsky's son in the U.S. So perhaps you could provide to us some information regarding this particular case. More specifically, to what extent is Mikhail Khodorkovsky able to make public from prison his concerns regarding political issues and respect for human rights in Russia? This level of access to the media, is it unusual for a prisoner in Russia? First of all, I put forward my opinions, and I've had the same opinions for a long time. I've been in the opposition since the year 2000, since the very first day Putin came to power, and my party as well. I'm part of the Liberal Democratic camp in Russia, so my opinions, the opinions expressed by me, are mine, and I've never changed my views. With regard to Mr. Khodorkovsky, he is a political prisoner, 100%. He was recognized as such by Amnesty International, as you probably are aware, and his crime, quote unquote, his crime, as I was saying, was to fund political opposition parties before the 2003 elections. He did a lot of philanthropy. He funded various initiatives in philanthropy, the provision of internet to schools in Russia, and encouraging internet freedom isn't very pleasant for an authoritarian regime, as we can well understand. So all of these things were the crimes committed by Mr. Khodorkovsky. His major crime was that he wasn't in support of Mr. Putin, and he didn't want to follow the race led by all of the other leaders of the big business corporations in Russia. When the director of a large corporation rises in opposition of the government or of projects supported by the government, that doesn't please the authorities. The government is very strict in its nature, and all of this began in 2003 after the incarceration of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. With regard to the second legal process, you will be aware that the first time he was condemned for apparently not having paid his taxes on the oil that he had sold, and the second time he was condemned for having stolen the oil that, according to the first trial, he had sold without paying taxes on it. So it's absolutely unbelievable, and those who had any doubts in 2003, 2004 lost any doubts they might have had after the last trial, which was really Kafkaesque, as The Economist stated in a report. So with regard to Mr. Khodorkovsky, it is a symbol, I believe, a symbol of Putinism, of the Putin regime. It represents the loss of independence for business. It also represents the loss of independence for the legal branch, because the courts were simply the instruments, the political instruments of the Kremlin. And it also represents the loss of the independence of the political life of political parties, because now, if you sit in the opposition, if you're a member of an opposition party, you cannot obtain funding. Nowhere. Because it is prohibited. No one will give you money because they fear that their fate will be similar to that of Mr. Khodorkovsky, and they'll be imprisoned. With regard to the opposition, the official opposition, I'd like you to explain the nature of the Coordination Council for Russian Opposition, which I imagine includes several political movements, and I would like to know if this is a preliminary step with a view to the elections that will take place in 2016, if my memory serves me right. Yes, it's planned for 2016. The Center for Strategic Research, which is a think tank created by people close to Mr. Putin in 2000, so these are loyal supporters of Putin. This has nothing to do with the opposition. And these people stated that if there is a financial crisis in 2 or 3 years' time, the provinces will join the cities in the protest. There will be a political crisis, and the regime will have to call elections by anticipation before 2016. You mentioned 2016, and that's the date announced for the time being. But as Harold Wilson, the former British Prime Minister, said, even 1 week is a long time in politics, and we don't know what's going to happen in 4 years' time. But personally, and a lot of my colleagues believe that things are going to change much more quickly in Russia, and the elections will have to be held sooner than 2016. In answer to your question, the Coordinating Council was elected, so it was a type of primary election. A few tens of thousands of people who support the opposition took part in this election for the Coordinating Council. There are 45 of us who sit on the council. It covers the whole spectrum from left to right, socialists, nationalists, liberals, conservatives, independents, nonpartisan members, etc. The whole spectrum is covered and represented, but for the time being, this has nothing to do with official elections, because the official elections are organized in a way that is neither free nor democratic. So we really can't contest the elections organized by the Putin regime, but with the pressure that is bubbling up with the demonstrations, the massive demonstrations we've seen over the last few years, and with the pressure exercised from the rest of the world, and that's what we're discussing here today with these personal sanctions that will hit certain people if it's passed, the situation might change. That's the possibility, and for the very first time in the last few years, there are opposition parties that are legal, that have legal status in Russia, because of what I mentioned. There was a small reform, and now there are opposition parties that can be registered and participate in elections. For example, I am a member of the Popular Freedom Party with Kasyadov and Demirishkov, and we are now registered legally, and we are entitled to participate in elections outright. And we're planning on participating in the local and municipal elections that take place every year in September. Thank you very much, Mr. Kara-Murza. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you, Mr. Jacob.
We're on a fair bit over our allotted time. For the benefit of members who have to make it back to the House of Commons, there is one of our little green buses waiting up top for you. If you leave right now, you should just barely make it back in time for question period to begin. So I'll encourage you to move towards the exits. To our witnesses, thank you very much. I know you've gone to considerable inconvenience to be here. We are very grateful indeed that you were able to attend today. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.
you.